People are waking up to the fact that there's something more that they can do. People are waking up to the fact that there's something more that they can do. In response to the crisis, and here's the very positive part, that by responding to the crisis, just like you are, Todd, by doing this, in response to the crisis, and here's the very positive part, that by responding to the crisis, just like you are, Todd, by doing this, you start to find more of your life purpose. You start to find more of your life purpose. And the way you can tell it's your life purpose is that by doing it, it's self-rewarding. And the way you can tell it's your life purpose is that by doing it, it's self-rewarding. By doing it, you are so, there's a compass of joy in there. By doing it, you are so, there's a compass of joy in there. So it means you have to shift sometimes from a existing function, whether it be like I was a housewife. So it means you have to shift sometimes from a existing function, whether it be like I was a housewife in Lakeville, Connecticut, or you have a certain job or a certain lifestyle, or you have a certain job or a certain lifestyle. If now because the crisis is so apparent, my metaphor is our crisis is a birth. My metaphor is our crisis is a birth of a more evolving co-creative species,
Well, Barbara, I want to get to that because I love when you talk about the crisis as a birth. And there's that whole ideology about the Chinese word for crisis is the same as the Chinese word for opportunity, and I want to get your opinion on that. There's that whole ideology about the Chinese word for crisis is the same as the Chinese word for opportunity, and I want to get your opinion on that. But let's talk about the crisis a little bit because so many of us have this feeling that, all the things that you mentioned, the economic, the political, the amount of wars going on in the world, so many of us have this feeling that, all the things that you mentioned, the economic, the political, the amount of wars going on in the world, that there's so much of it that is just bubbling up, and it feels like it's connected. There's so much of it that is just bubbling up, and it feels like it's connected in some way, but it's hard to really understand how it is all connected in some way. And how deep it runs and where it is going. How deep is this global crisis going to go? You mentioned it's potentially, the end of kind of civilization as we know it.
I think it really started to emerge in the mid-'60s with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. I think it really started to emerge in the mid-'60s with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And when Robert Mueller, Assistant Secretary General of the UN, tried to have a conference on the environment and the biosphere, there was no word for it. We didn't know we had an environment or a biosphere to protect. And then it began to become apparent as systems started to break down, but the general public didn't get it. And then it began to become apparent as systems started to break down, but the general public didn't get it. And if you just skip ahead, I think it really started with climate change. And if you just skip ahead, I think it really started with climate change and global warming, and that work that Al Gore and other people did, until it started to be front page news until it started to be front page news, our growth is not sustainable. It's a finite planet. Our growth is not sustainable. It's a finite planet, and economic growth at this scale cannot be sustained, and economic growth at this scale cannot be sustained, and we're beginning to get the feedback from nature. Now, here's the truth. There are no systems in existing power. That know how to handle a global crisis like this.
Right. Right.
The United Nations doesn't know it. Global corporations don't know it. But the interrelationship, as far as I understand it, is that we are one living planetary system. And its most intelligent species, that is to say us, started to overgrow and overpopulate in the womb. And then we started to get all these new scientific and technological powers. That started to give us powers we used to attribute to gods. We can blow up worlds. We can create little worlds in space. And so this self-centered, self-conscious species, suddenly in the last maybe 20, 30 years, very short, began to get feedback from nature, that doing the things we used to think were right, having many babies, learning to build, grow, and fight. That's what we did. Suddenly could destroy us. And I have a lot of empathy and sympathy with the whole need for cultural change, particularly at the level of successful people.
Right.
It's one thing if you don't have much power.
I love that definition.
I love mutually nurturing each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yummy. So, John, how would you define a healthy sex life?
Well, I think for fun, we'll define it as quantity and quality. and research has shown that when it comes for men, actually a good sex life, a healthy sex life, keeps you healthier than probably any other factor there is. If you're fortunate enough to have a partner, to maintain a healthy sex life, quantity, research has shown that the average married couple has sex once a week. And that's typically because men have their own hormonal cycle. And testosterone is the hormone that motivates a man to be interested in sex, also for women. But men need testosterone 30 times more, as we talked about in our seminar. And when a man doesn't have sex for 7 days, his testosterone levels on the 7th day will double, which will dramatically increase his motivation to figure out how can I get her in bed. So that tends to create the Saturday night ritual, which quite commonly at the end of the work week, people have a day of rest and go out or do something fun on Saturday, and then at 10 o'clock at night they tend to have sex. So that will be your most common aspect. But the research shows that men who have sex 2 to 3 times a week actually are the healthiest men on the planet. They live twice as long as everybody else, and they have dramatically low levels of heart disease and low levels of cancer and other sicknesses. So I just want to, when you talk about a healthy sex life, we need to recognize that there's some real research showing that sex actually makes us healthier. And it's more so the hormones that get generated through sex that what keeps us healthy. And also that the fact that we maintain that desire for sex is a sign of health as well. So healthy people tend to have regular sex life, and a regular sex life will keep you healthy. Now, the research on women is not so much quantity of sex, but it's quality of sex. It's if women really like sex, they tend to have dramatically lower levels of cancer and lower levels of heart disease, and they live much longer. So, a woman could have lots of sex, but if she's not fulfilled through sex, then she won't experience all those incredibly health benefits. And as we talked about in our seminar, there's a challenge for women when it comes to enjoying sex is if you're experiencing stress in your life, that can inhibit the production of, it can actually use up your oxytocin, the hormone that lowers stress for women. It's the nurturing hormone. So when women are feeling nurtured, their oxytocin goes up, and then when they give and they nurture others, they feel good, their stress goes down, but they also use up their oxytocin. And oxytocin is also the hormone that allows women to enjoy sex. So, you combine those two studies together, and we recognize that oxytocin is so critical for a woman to enjoy sex. And generally, if her hormones are out of balance, her stress levels will be higher, and she'll be low in oxytocin. And that imbalance of hormones, what happens over 50 for women is, and it could even happen before menopause in her 40s, is sex may be more difficult to climax, and it may be more difficult to enjoy sex, because literally due to all of the environmental factors that we face today, the pollutants, the chemicals, what's called xenoestrogens, it throws her estrogen balance off. And lower levels of estrogen can also cause a thinning of the vaginal walls, which means less circulation down south, which means slight tearing. It can cause pain. It can make sex less pleasurable. If sex is not pleasurable, then it's not something a woman's going to look forward to, and the quality goes down. So there's two aspects to quality, which is keeping healthy hormone balance, but so you can enjoy it, but also making sure you can communicate to your partner your needs in sex. And women have to know a man could love you and adore you, but he may not have a clue as to what you need to satisfy your needs in sex. And I know I didn't talk about this in my longer seminar, but I just want to briefly mention, because I've been testing something, but there's a gel that I've now been testing on many women who've given me the feedback that actually restores the vaginal lining in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
It's an aloe vera gel. So if people want to hear a video on that, they can go to MarsVenus.com.
That's record. So if you can get the two of us.
And where do I push to record?
It's recording. It's recording now. It's
on
the red. The red is record.
Okay.
Right? So. Can you get both of us?
Yes, you're both there, but
Can you go back?
from the side or?
Back further a little bit.
A giant breach in Earth's magnetic field. Presented by Science at NASA. December 16, 2008. NASA's 5 Themis spacecraft have discovered a breach in Earth's magnetic field 10 times larger than anything previously thought to exist. Solar wind can flow in through the opening to load up the magnetosphere for powerful geomagnetic storms. But the breach itself is not the biggest surprise. Researchers are even more amazed at the strange and unexpected way it forms, overturning long-held ideas of space physics. At first, I couldn't believe it, says Themis project scientist David Siebeck of the Goddard Space Flight Center. This finding fundamentally alters our understanding of the solar wind magnetosphere interaction. The magnetosphere is a bubble of magnetism that surrounds Earth and protects us from solar wind. Exploring the bubble is a key goal of the Themis mission, launched in February 2007. The big discovery came on June 3rd of the same year when the 5 probes serendipitously flew through the breach just as it was opening. Onboard sensors recorded a torrent of solar wind particles streaming into the magnetosphere, signaling an event of unexpected size and importance. The opening was huge, 4 times wider than Earth itself, says Wen-Hu Lee, a space physicist at the University of New Hampshire who has been analyzing the data. Lee's colleague Jimmy Rader, also of New Hampshire, says 10 to the 27 particles per second were flowing into the magnetosphere. That's a 10 followed by 27 zeros. This kind of influx is an order of magnitude greater than what we thought was possible. The event began with little warning when a gentle gust of solar wind delivered a bundle of magnetic fields from the sun to Earth. Like an octopus wrapping its tentacles around a big clam, solar magnetic fields draped themselves around the magnetosphere and basically cracked it open. The cracking was accomplished by means of a process called magnetic reconnection. High above Earth's poles, solar and terrestrial magnetic fields linked up or reconnected to form conduits for solar wind. Conduits over the Arctic and Antarctic quickly expanded. Within minutes, they overlapped over Earth's equator to create the biggest magnetic breach ever recorded by Earth-orbiting spacecraft. The size of the breach took researchers by surprise. We've seen things like this before, says Rader, but never on such a large scale. the entire day side of the magnetosphere was open to the solar wind. The circumstances of the breach were even more surprising. Space physicists have long believed that holes in Earth's magnetosphere open only in response to solar magnetic fields that point south. The Great Breach of June 2007, however, opened in response to a solar magnetic field that pointed north. To the layperson, this may sound like a quibble, but to a space physicist, it is almost seismic, says Siebeck. When I tell my colleagues, most react with skepticism, as if I'm trying to convince them that the sun rises in the west. Here is why they can't believe their ears. The solar wind presses against Earth's magnetosphere almost directly above the equator, where our planet's magnetic field points north. Suppose a bundle of solar magnetism comes along, and it points north too. The two fields should reinforce one another, strengthening Earth's magnetic defenses and slamming the door shut on